Good afternoon. My name is Steve Allred, and I'm an attorney here in Roseville, California, and I'm also the Religious Liberty Liaison for the Northern California Conference. And today we have a good topic to discuss in our webinar. We're calling it Religious Liberty in the Workplace. And we will focus mainly on the issue of religious liberty in the workplace, but we will also touch on a Supreme Court case that just was decided last night. One of my guests, Alan Reinach, wants to discuss that. And I think it's a good one to discuss because it deals with some of the current restrictions surrounding COVID-19 and religious gatherings and gatherings in general. So some of the questions we'll be asking during this webinar today, one specific one is, should Christians ever assert their civil rights, specifically in the workplace? And if we do assert our civil rights, the question is, how should we do it? What should our attitude be? And then we're going to talk about the state of the law, both in the United States as a whole. We'll talk about Title VII a little bit, as well as in California here specifically, when it comes to protections for people of faith in the workplace. We'll talk about religious discrimination, harassment, and religious accommodation as well. And we're going to hear from someone today, a special guest we have with us, who was the victim of a workplace discrimination and whose case went to court. And we're going to briefly, we're going to hear her story, and we're going to, talk about what we can learn from that. And we're going to also briefly, I think, touch on how Christian employers can honor God in the workplace, while avoiding creating a hostile work environment for employees who may believe differently than them. That's an issue, too, that comes up. Now, I should note that at the outset of this webinar, that today's date is April 10, 2021. So some of the things we're going to be talking about today are applicable to today. They may not be applicable, 5 years from now. Just keep in mind that we're recording this here in early 2021, if you're watching this at a later time. And that also brings me to one other disclaimer, and that is that neither Alan Reinach nor I, we're both attorneys, will be giving you legal advice for your particular situation. We are not your lawyers. Nothing we say in this video or live stream constitutes legal advice or creates an attorney-client relationship between us. If you need that kind of advice, talk to a lawyer about your specific case. So I want to start off here by inviting or welcoming my friend Alan Reinach, who is our special guest here today. Welcome, Alan.
Thank you, Steve. And I'm laughing at your disclaimer.
I thought about it yesterday as I was thinking about what we were going to talk. Like, what? We should do that. Who knows? So thanks for being here.
We're not giving legal advice. You want legal advice? Call us directly. Right.
And we will give your contact information at the end of today's webinar, so that if any of our listeners, viewers do have a religious discrimination employment issue you want to talk over with a lawyer, Alan is the best out there when it comes to this issue. He may not agree with that, but I think he really is, and actually probably an expert in this area, if not one of the foremost experts. So anyway,
well, Steve, is there I didn't ask you beforehand, but is there a chat? Can we put it up in the chat? Can people submit questions by chat?
Yes, there is. Now, I'll be honest with you. Today, I am a little bit handicapped because I'm running this by myself. And so I am let me see if I can find the chat feature here. There is a private chat feature. If we have guests out there who want to, comments. Here we go. Comments. Yes. Click on a comment. All right. So if anybody does want to comment in the comments section, I'm not sure if that's the best way to do it though, Alan, because that's public. And so they're going to see your info. I don't know, whatever. You could put your info in the comment section there, Alan, if you want, and people can contact you through there. Of course, you can always go to the Church State. Is it churchstate.org?
Correct.
That's your website. And there is a way to contact you there. So we'll get to that. And if anybody does want to contact Alan directly, just go to churchstate.org. And that's the website of the Church State Council, which Alan is the executive director and general counsel for. As we get started here, Alan, I want to just kind of set the stage for what we're going to be talking about. And before we do, perhaps we should take a brief moment, though, to discuss the case that came down last night from the Supreme Court. It was
Sure.
A case that involved meetings, Bible study meetings, or any kind of meeting, actually, in private homes. And of course, currently we are living during the time of COVID-19. Some state governments have issued restrictions on the types of gatherings and sizes of gatherings and what you can do in those gatherings, and wearing masks and social distancing and all that fun stuff. And so there were some religious folks, I think Christians in Southern California, I believe, who challenged the state's current restriction on no more than 3 families getting together in private homes. And by the way, this restriction applies not specifically to religious gatherings. It applies to any kind of gathering of any type. But this particular individual or church challenged it, and it went to the Ninth Circuit. The Ninth Circuit essentially said the state's restriction was reasonable. They looked at it under a rational basis standard of review, and then it went up to the Supreme Court, and they asked for the Supreme Court to basically issue an injunction, I think, right. To keep California from enforcing this on them, because they want to have more than 3 families having Bible studies. And they framed it as a religious liberty issue. So, Alan, how would you tell us more about this case? And, is it a religious liberty issue? Is this something where Christians, speaking of civil rights, ought to be asserting their civil rights and saying, this is wrong, we're going to stand up against this?
Oh, Steve, we lawyers rarely have a short yes or no answer to these questions.
We got lots of time.
There's an old joke about, you never saw a one-handed lawyer because on the other hand, right? So, let me start this way. First of all, I think that states like California that took a prohibition, heavy approach to dealing with the pandemic are somewhat misguided, okay? Because in order to beat this thing, we need cooperation, we need collaboration, we need consensus. We've got to work together as a community to beat the pandemic. And you don't get cooperation by simply passing rules and saying, don't do this, don't do that. Because we Americans, we hear don't do this, don't do that. And that's the first thing we want to go out and do. So I think, trying to regulate what people are doing in their homes during the pandemic, I think was misguided to begin with, okay? But I also think that the Supreme Court has taken us into a very interesting place when it comes to religious freedom. And I got to give you a little bit of background so that you understand. Scalia back in 1990 in a peyote case basically dumbed down the First Amendment and said, look, in most cases, we're not going to give religious freedom any particular protection at all. If you have a rule, a law, a policy that applies across the board to everybody, religion gets no special treatment. Well, after a couple of decades of that, 3 decades of that, the newly conservative dominant court is very uncomfortable with the rule that the conservative court created. And so rather than just overturn the rule, which they may do, they're going the other way. They're basically saying that almost no rule, at least in the COVID environment, no rule is actually religion neutral. And even though this particular rule really was religion neutral, the court's saying, well, no, as long as there is any business that they call a comparable business, then the rule, that it's treated better than religion, then the rule is under-inclusive, and religion is, the religious liberty interest is going to win. So, the debate is, what do you compare a particular religious activity to? What do you compare a home Bible study to? Do you compare it to the risk level when you go to get your hair cut? Do you compare it to the risk level when you go shopping at Costco or at the grocery store? And the Supreme Court basically said yes to all of that. And so as long as any other businesses really are treated better than the home Bible study, you can't subject the home Bible study to these restrictions. It's a little too soon to tell where the court is going to go with this. It's certainly a very robust protection for religious liberty. So I guess, I don't like the previous rule. And, those of us who've been longtime religious liberty advocates, we don't like the rule coming from the Peyote case. But I'm not sure I like this one either, because it's kind of it used to be the state always wins and religion always loses. Now it seems like religion always wins and the state always loses. And I'm not sure that's the healthy balance either. But I'd still rather have religious liberty winning than losing for the most part. So so we're clear.
Yeah, and you wonder if, it's interesting that the religion we were dealing with in the Peyote case was not Christianity. And it seems like these cases that are coming down now are definitely, if giving, the folks who are winning here favored status in a way, right? Mm-hmm. And that is, it might seem good, but I don't know that it's going to have long-term good repercussions. Of course, this is all assuming that we believe that COVID is a problem. And frankly, we live in a world today where a lot of folks don't see the facts on, that issue the same. And so I think that's really complicating things, because we have folks who really believe these are completely illegitimate rules that any state government is putting forth, no matter if it's California or wherever, simply because they just don't think we need them at all.
Steve, I have several very close friends and colleagues who have gotten very, very sick and been hospitalized. I have, people in my circle who have died of COVID. So, there's no question in my mind, I've taken this very, very seriously.
So that is, we'll see what happens with the case. I think is it Tandon? Is that the name of the case there? And,
Tandon against Newsom.
Yeah. So we'll see how that develops.
Well, it's basically a moot point at this point, because California is starting to open up, and the restrictions would have been lifted anyway. But so it's more relevant in terms of a kind of a signal of where the court is going in the future with these religion claims. Now, on our topic, unfortunately, the court declined to take some cases dealing with workplace religious freedom. And I know we're going to get there at some point in our discussion too.
Yeah, and there are some cases. Actually, just this last week, they denied certiorari to at least one case. I think you said there were a couple others as well.
Cases.
Two, yeah, that's partisan. Now, here's the thing. We're going to be talking today about when should Christians assert their civil rights. And I think right now we're going to, this is a great time to kind of like maybe juxtapose again this, these different cases here with, and maybe our response or our view of what should be done, because you've got the restriction on gatherings, okay? And some Christians are like, yeah, we need to be fighting this because A, COVID's not a big deal. B, the government is trying to keep us from having home Bible studies. Well, I'm not sure that latter assumption, actually, I'm not sure either of those assumptions are true, but that latter one, as you look at it, actually, again, the restriction was across the board, whether it be religious gatherings or any kind of gatherings. It was not just restricting home Bible study groups. And so I don't see a religious liberty component there per se. Now, if you get down into the weeds and say, well, maybe we're dealing with, maybe you could make some comparisons with maybe you could make that argument, but we're going to be talking today about when it's appropriate for Christians to stand up and say, number one, assert their rights under current law. Number two, maybe even, civilly disobey. We're not going to get into that too much because we already did that in our last webinar.
Well, Steve, if I can jump in here, Jesus called us to be peacemakers, right? Blessed are the peacemakers. Matthew 18, there's a certain process for resolving conflict, right? The problem with this particular case is that the Christians did not wait for enforcement to come to them. They went preemptively to attack the measure, okay? It'd be one thing if the cops were knocking on your door saying, break it up, you're violating the rules. And then you say, look, we have a conflict here and we need to resolve it, and the courts are the way to resolve it, right? That'd be one, but that's not the situation. This situation is where the Christians go looking for a fight, essentially. And I just don't see that approach. That's not the approach we take, the Church State Council. We always, when we're dealing with employers that violate religious freedom, and particularly Sabbath workplace conflicts, we always give the employer an opportunity to resolve the conflict early before we file in court. Court becomes a last resort if we can't get a conflict resolved.
So let's set the stage for the rest of our discussion here as we kind of shift gears and start focusing on religious freedom in the workplace. First of all, what kind of reputation should Christians have in the workplace? And before you answer that question, Ellen, I want to just throw out some biblical principles that I see, and I'm sure you can add to these and then kind of give us, some other thoughts as well. But, first of all, God does call us to be his witnesses. And so a lot of Christians feel called to, share Christ in the workplace. And that is definitely a valid, wish and desire and calling that God has given all of us. I think God wants his people to be people of integrity, have good reputations, be good workers, and be respectful of our employers as much as possible, as well as government leaders. We're not getting into that again as much. And you kind of talked about Jesus calling us to be peacemakers. I think of the admonition in Hebrews chapter 12. It says, make every effort to live in peace with everyone. Hebrews 12:14. And of course, Peter's admonition that he says, listen, if you suffer, make sure you're suffering as a Christian, not as a evildoer and a meddler or whatever it may be. Make sure you're being persecuted for the right things. If you're just being persecuted, that's not necessarily a sign that you're following God, right? So what would you say, Ellen, about anything else to add to that as far as, how do we approach this topic, of civil rights and Christians asserting their civil rights? What's kind of the basis before we even get there?
Well, as far as our attitude at work, I think, if we are doing our best work, we're working knowing that we're serving God and we're serving man and we're giving 110%. That's part of our witness, right? Mm-hmm. And if we go the extra mile and not just try to do as little as possible, but do as, really give it your best shot, right? And I will say my clients typically, I don't even have to tell them. Their attitude is, hey, if I get Sabbath off, I'm willing to work Christmas, New Year's, Thanksgiving, any other day, 4th of July, any other day that other people don't want to work, because I appreciate being able to get my Sabbath off and having that kind of spirit of consideration for your fellow employees. And I think having that great attitude in the workplace goes a long way towards getting the cooperation one needs for Sabbath.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, and so you and I may be assuming that it's appropriate to assert your civil rights at the right time and in the right place, but some people may not share that assumption. So I want to just throw out a couple of things, and then I'm sure you can add to these as well. You have the biblical admonitions to, avenge not yourself, for example. Don't try to fight your own battles. God will, take care of it. Vengeance is mine, right? So you have some people who kind of, say, well, listen, that tells them not to do anything, to kind of take a passive approach to any kind of civil rights violation. But
I disagree.
Okay.
But anyway, right. I don't think that means be passive. I think that it does mean that our spirit, some people are very litigious and they'll sue, on the drop of a hat, so to speak, right? Mm-hmm. So if the motive is I'm going to get back at somebody, well, that's obviously a motive that is inconsistent with the biblical admonition. Right.
You're getting to the heart of it, like what our motivation is. I think that's a really important aspect. Yeah.
Well, I will tell you that, by and large, all of the Adventist clients that come to me having lost jobs with Sabbath, their attitude is, I don't want this to happen to somebody else. They don't come with dollar signs in their eyes. Oh, I want to, get lots and lots of money. they feel that an injustice was done,
Hmm.
and they think that the employer needs to be confronted with the wrong that they've done, and they need to do something to make it right. But
Yeah.
it's not about vengeance, and it's really about, well, if they do it to me, they're going to do it to the next guy and the next one, and they have to be taught to stop.
And I think that actually that attitude aligns very well with the biblical admonitions to stand up for the oppressed. I think of Proverbs 31, 8 and 9, where it talks about, speak up for those who can't speak for themselves. That is a valid biblical principle as well. So and I think instead of the passive or the aggressive, extremes, because those are the two kind of opposite approaches that you're talking about, I think Jesus does give us a third way in Matthew chapter 5, for example, where he talks about praying for your enemies and reaching out to them, right? I want to just bring up a couple of, because we may have some viewers who are saying, well, wait a minute, are there any examples in the Bible of people asserting their civil rights? And I think there are. Tell us about Paul.
Well, you probably know it better than I do, but Paul, asserted his rights as a Roman. And, he got to Rome because he asserted his rights and got a hearing in Rome.
And and actually, there's at least 3 instances in Scripture where he specifically brought up the fact that he was a Roman citizen, or said, "Hey, you can't beat me because I'm a Roman citizen," and you need to walk me out of town because you did this, without a trial, and so on and so forth. So I think there is that example in Scripture, and I think that we have to balance the whole concept of not taking vengeance, like you're talking about, which I think it's more to an attitude issue, but it can also apply practically. And then with the concept of we need to advocate vigorously for the oppressed. How do we do those things at the same time? And that's where I think we as Christians kind of take a different approach than the world does on any of this, right?
Well, and since you mentioned Matthew 5, I want to throw in a very interesting insight on turn the other cheek, because what we're told is that the natural human reaction to conflict is fight or flight, right? So somebody hits you on the cheek, and what do? You either punch them back or you run away. And Jesus is advocating a third way. It's not punch them back. It's not run away. If you hit me on this cheek and then I turn the other cheek, I'm in your face. I'm confronting the wrongdoing. And I'm challenging you to think about what you're doing and to change your behavior. It's a very different approach. It's addressing conflict. It's not just being a doormat, let people walk all over you, and harm you, and you're not going to do anything about it.
Right. So we live in a country, and in our state, we'll talk specifically about the laws here, where there are actually some fairly good protections for people in the workplace. Although there are some limitations on those protections as well that we'll discuss today. Some things that need to be improved. So I think what I'm hearing from you, and I actually think this is really important, is our attitude is key when it comes to asserting our civil rights. And I think the question, of course, a Christian would ask is, hey, is this going to honor God? Right? Is this going to glorify Him? And clearly, if you have a job requirement that requires you to violate your conscience or disobey God's law, you shouldn't do that. But then, what's the next step? Do you just quietly leave? Do you try to work with the employer and be assertive in a kind and respectful way? And do you ever go to court and deal with that? In the United States, of course, and here in California, we have laws that allow religious people who have experienced harassment, discrimination, or failure to accommodate in the workplace. It gives them a right of action in court. Let's talk about the law and what the employee's rights are in the workplace, in California and in the United States generally when it comes to practicing their faith.
Well, we're fortunate here in California. In a lot of parts of the country, workers' rights are not very well protected in the courts, and the courts routinely are biased in favor of the companies. In California, we do have a much more level playing field, and we have some robust protections for workers' rights. I've been part of the workers' rights community for many years, working to strengthen those laws. And so, you think of the general non-discrimination laws that we have and laws against harassment in the workplace. Well, that includes religious harassment. And, telling an Adventist employee, well, you have to work on Sabbath or else, that's a form of harassment also, to make somebody, coerce them basically into trying to, make them violate their faith as a condition of keeping their job. So we do have strong protections. The process requires that before you go to court, you have to file with either the state or federal civil rights agencies, and those agencies provide an opportunity for mediation, for resolution of the conflict before going to court. So we routinely utilize those services and say to the employer, yes, we're willing to sit down with you and talk about this and see if we can get it resolved. If we wind up in court, it's because the employer was not interested in getting the case resolved.
So let's say that, someone does have a violation of their job requires them to violate their conscience or their religious beliefs, and they want to, they go to their employer, the employer's not willing to work with them. Let's say it's a failure to accommodate, type of claim, which really means the employer has not resolve the conflict between the employee's religious belief and the workplace requirement, right? What is the standard that the employer is held to currently under both federal and state law when it comes to being able to avoid that burden or, that
Sure.
accommodation or whatever?
Okay, so the law speaks in terms of the obligation of the employer to provide reasonable accommodation. Well, what does that mean? In a lot of parts of the country, reasonable accommodation could mean just giving somebody every other Saturday off if they're an Adventist, because they don't see the necessity of completely resolving the conflict or eliminating the conflict between the faith obligation and the work obligation. We were successful in getting our California regulations to recognize what we call the elimination test. So it's not an accommodation if the employer says, well, I think it's reasonable, I'll give you every other Saturday off. Well, that may seem reasonable to the employer, but it's not a reasonable accommodation as that is now defined in the California regulations or in federal law here in most of the states served in my territory in the Pacific Union Conference, except for Utah, which is in a different under a different federal circuit. But, so, assuming that we get past, so a company doesn't reasonably accommodate, then what's their excuse? What's their defense? Their defense is, well, it was too hard. It was an undue hardship. Now, under federal law, and this is the issue that we're pressing the Supreme Court to deal with, under federal law, it's minimal. It's almost no hardship at all is sufficient for the employer to have a valid defense. Under other civil rights laws, like disability law, for example, undue hardship has to be a significant difficulty or expense, something more than just a hardship. And in California, we succeeded back in 2012 in getting a measure passed by the state legislature to apply significant difficulty or expense to religious accommodation. So that's the standard now for companies. And frankly, it's a rare situation where a company is going to incur a significant difficulty or expense in order to let an Adventist have a schedule and not have to work on Sabbath. I can recall one case in 28 years where I said to the gentleman, well, if there's nobody else that can do your job on Sabbath, then I can see where the employer might have a point. Maybe you should start looking for another job, But, it's very, very rare. that
Mhm.
you really run into that sort of situation.
Yeah, and really, California's FEHA statute, the Fair Employment Housing Act, is probably the most protective in the United States when it comes to this particular issue, right? Because
It is,
the de
and
minimis.
I frankly take some pride in that because I had more than a small hand in bringing that about.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I should note that so somebody can come to the employer and say, "I have a religious belief," and we can talk about the fact that you know the plaintiff's belief must be religious and it must be sincerely held. I was reviewing some of the case law on this a while back, and atheists, by the way, are protected under this as well because there is the freedom not to believe as well. The courts have found, right? I think there's a good Fifth Circuit case on that back from 1975. There are some cases.
Yes, but veganism is not protected.
and there was one here.
The Friedman case.
Well, but I don't know if you remember Brown v. Pena. It was the cozy kitten cat food case where this person described that was part of their religious belief to be able to, I think, eat this stuff or something. And the court said, no, that's a mere personal preference. So
I didn't know we're going to get grossed out here on this webinar today, Steve.
But let's talk about. I want to talk before because we're gonna actually bring in a guest here in a few minutes. One of your current clients whose case has
very significant case.
Very significant case. But before we do that, and I think she'll be joining us in a minute here, let's talk about the Abercrombie case because I think that it has some bearing on what we'll be talking about with her case, doesn't it? I mean, as far as at least the aspect of, an employer cannot make an applicant's religious practice, whether they know about it or not, a factor in employment decisions. This was a 2015 case. And who wrote that? Was it Scalia? I can't remember. I forget who authored.
Yes, it was Scalia.
I think it was Scalia. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yes. Just doing a double take, but yes.
Give us a little summary of Abercrombie from back in the day.
Sure. So Samantha Eloff is a young Muslim woman, appears for a job interview at a local Abercrombie and Fitch store wearing a headscarf. And they have a rating system. They interview her. She passes muster under their rating system, but the assistant store manager who interviewed her noted that she was wearing a headscarf, never asked her about it, called the regional manager. What do I do? I got this girl, she's qualified to be hired, but she's wearing this headscarf. And they discussed it. They assumed that she was wearing it because she was Muslim, and they decided not to hire her. So there was no fact dispute. She was not hired because the employer assumed, and rightly assumed, as it turned out, that she was wearing the headscarf because she was Muslim. Now, one of the key issues in that case was whether, what's the status of notice? Does a statute require that the employee or the job applicant in this case be the one to give notice? And the court said, no, there's no notice requirement in the statute. What the statute requires is that, the employer can't make the religious practice a factor in the decision, the adverse employment decision. So if the decision not to hire somebody is because, well, no, we're not going to accommodate their wearing the headscarf. Abercrombie, by the way, has a blanket no hats rule. And they put a huge emphasis on having a look policy. That's their whole sort of culture, and their ethos is the Abercrombie look. And so they actually argued in a couple of district court cases vigorously that allowing a Muslim woman to wear a headscarf would be such a offense to their look policy and culture that it would be a hardship. And the judges basically laughed them out of court.
So
no, that doesn't cut it.
Yeah. So let's talk about, for example, a lot of our viewers are probably members of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, which you and I are members of, and maybe wondering how this applies in a situation where they apply for a job and they want Sabbaths off, Saturday Sabbaths. And then let's say they do or don't tell the potential employer. How would this case affect their situation?
Well, I mean, it's clear that if an employer if an employer knows that you need Sabbath off and they make the decision not to hire you because of that, they should lose.
If they know that it's because of your religious faith,
right.
Or actually, in this case, even if they don't, right?
Well, but look, that's the way the law is written. Getting the judges to actually, man up and do the right thing is another thing. We're going to trial this summer in a case that we should have won on papers because there's no factual dispute. They didn't hire this lady because of Sabbath. Should have been end of story. We're going to bring in a guest whose case the judge found a way to avoid the law, got reversed on appeal, and now it's back to the judge who's going to have to confront the law and the facts again, and we'll see if he finds another way to wiggle around it. But,
nice.
We're certainly going to hope that he doesn't.
So let's do that. Let's bring in our guest here. We're going to talk about some real world examples, and I want to just welcome Teresa Brown. Thank you for being here.
You're muted, Teresa. You got to unmute.
Okay.
There we go.
There we go. Teresa, thanks so much for taking the time to be here. And you are a Seventh-day Adventist Christian, correct? And live here in Northern California. And you had a situation that has gone all the way down through the court systems, and you had a trial. I think you lost the trial. Now you appealed, and you won the appeal, and it's going back to the trial court. Tell us a little bit about your story. Let's just start at the beginning. What happened?
But before we get to, I just want to give this little introduction, Steve.
Sure.
Department of Corrections is one of the very largest employers in the state
of California.
And this case is very important because it really implicates whether the state government agency that employs tens of thousands of people can just reject those who, whether it's Sabbath, whether it's Sunday, just reject applicants because they have religious commitments. And it just doesn't make any sense to me. But anyway, I'll let Teresa tell her story.
So I was actually an employee for CDCR when I seen they were hiring, and signs everywhere saying they were hiring for correction officers, and they were actually hiring thousands of correctional officers. So at the time, I was actually on the verge of divorce, and it seemed like a great opportunity, a great career, great benefits. And I felt like I already had the foot in the door. So I went ahead and applied. I went through the process online with the application. And I remember seeing one of the questions was, I don't know the exact wording, but it asked, would taking a test on a Saturday be like an issue? So I did mark that it would be an issue. And I thought, well, maybe that's going to disqualify me right there because maybe they have their rules. But they contacted me and said, we would like you to take the written test. And so I took the written test. It was about 4 hours, and I passed it. And so I waited, and they contacted me again, and they said, there's a physical test we'd like you to take. Physical meaning running with weights and, passing their exam, their physical exam. But the other issue was it was on a Saturday, my Sabbath. So I actually contacted them and I said, is there any way that I can take this physical exam on any day besides a Saturday? And they said, well, no, because that is the day we do the physical testing. But I said, well, can you talk to your manager or, talk to anybody and figure out if you can get me another day?
Hmm.
We were back and forth and back and forth, and they finally got back to me and said that they were gonna find a different day for me. I don't recall if it was a Tuesday or a Wednesday, but it was a weekday. And I showed up, and from other officers, I had heard that the physical test, there was about 50 to 100 candidates, and I show up and there's no one there but me. So they had actually did their part in making this day for me, and there was officers there to test me and write down my how long I ran for and my time. So I passed the test, and now I needed to wait for the interview. That was the one I was kind of eagerly waiting for because I wanted to, go to the next step. So then they called me for the interview, and it was actually a recorded interview. The gal interviewing me recorded the interview, and I had got a letter from my pastor saying why, as a Seventh-day Adventist, I couldn't work the Sabbath. It was a really long, very jam-packed information page. So I felt really confident that me taking this letter would be, all they needed to understand why I needed the Sabbath. So I did go to the interview. We went through a long process of a questionnaire, pages and pages, and we finally got to the days. There was a question that asked, will you be available 24/7? Weekends, holidays, etc. And I put a note on there so that they could ask me about it. So when that question came, I handed the lady a letter, the sergeant, and I said, here's my letter. I cannot work the Sabbath. Let me explain what the Sabbath is. I told her couldn't work Friday after sunset all the way till Saturday sunset, which was my Sabbath. She was kind of confused. She didn't know what Sabbath was. So we kind of spent a few minutes talking about it. I had handed her the letter. She kind of briefly looked through it. She asked, well, so you wouldn't be able to work these hours? And I said, well, it's not hours. She was trying to get to, what hours can you come in? And I said, no, it's sunset, sundown. She looked a little baffled, but I did tell her, and I laughed earlier, Alan, when you said that, because I did tell her I will be here Sunday, I will be here Christmas, I can be here Thanksgiving, I can be a night shift. You could throw me anywhere you want as long as you give me those hours. So she did make a note of that. And so I left that interview thinking that I had did my part in informing her of what religion I was from, what my hours were, what I was willing, because I was just asking for the Sabbath, everything, all the other days that I was willing to work. And so I waited thinking, is she going to contact me after this? And she did. She contacted me, gave me the next steps. And so after she gave me the next steps, I was really confident. I felt, okay, well, since I told her about my Sabbath and she's still contacting me, that means I'm moving forward. And so I gave her all the documents she was asking for, hunt down documents that they ask you for. I got them into her. There was timelines to everything. Turned those in, and she'd get back to me, and there was more steps, and I'd get back to her, and then she said, okay, you'll hear from us. And so then there was that waiting game of waiting for the next step, the next letter. And, a little while did go by, and I actually got the letter in the mail, and I think I remember doing a little giddy, dance and laugh, thinking this is the next step. But unfortunately, when I opened the letter, it said I was disqualified from the process. And when I went to see why I was disqualified from the process, there was a check mark saying I was disqualified because I was unwilling to work weekends, nights, and holidays,
Hmm.
which was not the truth. It was actually the other way around. I was willing, but because I wasn't willing to
To work
work.
on Sabbath.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
But I was more confused about, I would have thought they would have contacted me and asked, can you give us a little bit more information? Um, Maybe her manager could have contacted me. I thought, how can they just kind of check me off and we're done and you're
Sure.
done with the process?
And so, and this is a story where you're not dealing with a mom and pop shop who doesn't have enough staff to cover weekend shifts.
Mhm.
You're dealing with one of the largest employers in California, as Alan mentioned before, and they're saying, no, we cannot give you Saturdays off. Even if we schedule you on every other undesirable shift, we still can't accommodate you, which seems really implausible, right? As you think about the amount of employees they have, and so on and so forth. In fact, in reading your reply brief, to the appellate court, or I think it was, I think it was brought out there very well that the CDCR never actually showed that it would have been even a hardship for them, right?
Mhm.
Um,
Well, my husband's a correction officer, and he named to me, they could have did this, they could have did that. Me and you could have done swaps. You could have. He named about a dozen ways that it could have happened, and he said they wouldn't even have to do anything. You could have
You
done it
know,
yourself. And
prob-
Alan, so I don't forget, my husband was also military when they hired him, meaning he's not available all the time. And he gets called, or he would get called to, you know, get drafted. And,
mhm.
they didn't know ahead of time. He would just say, hey, I got to go to war. I'm leaving.
Part of Army Reserve or something. Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, reserves get called up. Providentially, Steve, while this case was going on,
mhm.
we got a call from a kid who had just been hired to work at the prison in Tehachapi, and he was struggling to get an accommodation. And so we filed charges, and we went to a mediation with the Department of Fair Employment and Housing, and the warden shows up. Now, he had managed to avoid working on Sabbath up until then. He'd been working hard, but they had put it on him basically to swap and do stuff. So we came into the mediation, and he knew that there was a particular, they call it like a management position, that nobody wanted. It was a nighttime position, and you're sitting there and nothing's going on. Nobody wanted it. It was open, but it had Sabbath off. It had Friday and Saturday night off. It was like a Sunday through Thursday position. And so, we go to mediation. We're like, just give me this one. And it took the guy that he brought the sheet of all the positions. It took him like an hour to go through it and finally find the thing, but they accommodated him. And so he was a witness in our case, and we showed the court, look, here's a kid, he's been working almost 2 years as a new hire, and he hasn't worked a single day on Sabbath. So how can they, stand before us and say, they can't accommodate? Here's somebody they are accommodating, brand new, new hire. So on the facts, we certainly deserve to win. But again, we're going to be submitting more briefs and arguing again with the judge, because it was a bench trial. It was not a jury trial. And the judge is going to get to decide.
So Teresa, can I ask you a personal question?
Mhm.
I've had some people tell me, because I have worked on some cases like yours and, with Ellen for people, religious people who have asserted their civil rights and so on and so forth in the workplace. And I've had some church members tell me, you know what, you shouldn't do that. You should just, quietly walk away. Why didn't you walk away and just say, okay, forget it? Why did you choose? I'm just curious on a personal level, and there's no wrong answer here. Why did you choose to say, you know what, I want to follow through with this? And, as a Christian, what influenced you to say, I'm going to try to see if we can rectify this?
So when I was working at CDCR, I was working as a nurse assistant, and I knew another nurse assistant who was Seventh-day Adventist. I was finding a loop on not working on the Sabbath, but she wasn't. And so when this happened, I felt, she shouldn't have to do that. Nobody should. You shouldn't be excluded to be a correctional officer because you're Seventh-day Adventist. If someone goes and say I don't get the job and someone wants to be a correction officer and they're Seventh-day Adventist, I don't want to say you're not able to get that job because you're Seventh-day Adventist, you're excluded. So I didn't want this to happen to someone else.
That's neat. Yeah. So you're thinking, well, if it's happening to me, it's going to happen to someone else. You knew someone it was happening to. Yeah. And, Ellen, you see these kind of cases all the time, and I've worked on a few of them with you. And I know that it's amazing how many times people are either denied employment because they're unwilling to work on the Sabbath, or let go, or constructively discharged, or whatever, because of the Sabbath. It's not like you have a dearth of cases, unfortunately, right?
Yeah, people are surprised when they hear about what I do. Oh, you mean, that happens here? And yeah, it happens a lot. We were talking about the law earlier, Steve, and one of the really cool developments that would have been very relevant in Teresa's case, had it been the law at the time, there was a regulation that we pressed for that was enacted last year here in California. When, like in your case, Teresa, they had a question about your availability. And so you were really put in a spot. You had to disclose in the hiring process that you were not available on Sabbath. If you had been told that you didn't have to disclose that, it would have been a completely different story. They would have just hired you along with 10,000 other people. And then once you were working there, you would have, done what you could to swap and to, try to navigate getting Sabbath off, right? But it has always been illegal to screen people out because of Sabbath. The new regulation says that when employers and look, companies legitimately do want to know about the availability of job applicants, but they're not supposed to use that question to screen people out. And so what the new regulation says is, well, if you're going to ask about availability, you have to let the applicant know not to say if their unavailability is because of religion or medical condition or disability. So if you had been faced with that application, you could have just said, yeah, I'm available. And we would never be here in court like we've been fighting for how many years now?
7 now.
Is it that long?
Yeah, because
when was it that you applied?
I think it was 2015 or late 2014, end of the year probably.
Wow. So yeah, we're going on 6-7 years since this all started.
Yeah.
Sheesh.
Wow.
And I want to mention something to you, Steve. I know the opposing counsel keeps bringing up that hiring me would have been a safety issue. And right now, during the whole COVID deal, my husband says there was hundreds of officers out, and they were able to figure it out. The prison didn't shut down. There was nothing happened.
So safety, meaning that they wanted your availability all the time,
Yes.
so that they can ensure the safety of the facility and everybody in there.
That
And
was,
if you weren't available, they're saying that would be a safety issue.
yes.
But you're saying that because right now it's clear that they're running very understaffed, they're not concerned about it. There's no safety issues right now, right? Even though
we were able to figure it out, and there was hundreds of officers out.
yeah.
But Steve, their arguments are so ludicrous because what we showed at trial is, so, supposing there is an emergency at a prison and they're trying to get in as many bodies as they can, to staff the emergency, which of course is reasonable that they would do that. But, so we asked questions like, well, supposing somebody was home watching the football game and they'd had a 6-pack of beer, would they be required to come in? Well, no, not if they're intoxicated. No, they would not be required to come in. So they treat the person who's had the 6-pack of beer more favorably than the Seventh-day Adventists. Well, what if they were on vacation and they went up to Tahoe and they were out of town? They're out of state. Well, no, they're not going to have to come back from out of state. What have you. So there's a lot of reasons what people do on their days off, right?
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of reasons why people would not be available to come back in an emergency. So
Right.
The fact that Teresa might not be available because of Sabbath is just another one of those reasons. It really does not impact operations at all.
When do you folks hope to get this case resolved? I mean, it's going back to the trial court now, and do you have a date for a hearing? Or
I think the briefing is due this summer, and then I don't know how long it's going to take the judge to sit on it and give us another opinion. And if he does, is it going to be a tentative opinion? He's going to let us argue with him some more.
Yeah.
I don't know. We'll see. But I would hope by the end of the year we might have something.
Yeah, good. Well, and this might be a good time, Ellen, to talk about what you offer. People who are experiencing problems like Teresa's. What does the Church State Council offer to either church members? And by the way, you represent people who are not Seventh-day Adventist Christians. You've represented folks who observe Sunday. You've represented, Muslims, Catholics, Mormons, whatever, right? So,
sure.
What can someone do if they're having a problem like Teresa's? What do they do? What do you offer them?
Well, all right. So the Church State Council is a ministry of the Religious Liberty Department of the Pacific Union Conference. So we serve a 5-state region, right? Arizona, Nevada, Utah, Hawaii, and California. Great part of the country to have to travel in and visit and work in. As an Easterner, as a New Yorker, I just love it. So this is a service that is essentially funded by your tax dollars, by your tithe dollars. So we provide legal services to those who suffer religious discrimination. And I would say probably 2/3 to 3/4 of our cases are Seventh-day Adventist clients. But yes, Adventists have always believed that religious liberty belongs to everybody and that we will stand up for the religious freedom of everyone, not just for those who believe the way we do. And so, yeah, it's been wonderful to work and to get to know some devout Muslim people and people of other Christians communities and some Jewish clients over the years. It's been a wonderful experience. I've learned that Muslims are quite receptive to prayer and to our praying in the name of Jesus. They believe in Jesus in some sense, not the same way we do, but it's been a very enriching experience for me, and certainly it's a witness to them that Christians are willing to stand up for their rights. But as a ministry, there's never any charge out of pocket for those who come to us and need help. And if you think about it, when people lose their jobs, they're not really in a position to fund legal services.
Right. And so people can come to the Church State Council and you will have some sort of a, interview with them generally and ask them about their situation and, give them options as far as what you're able to do to help them. And like you said, there's no charge out of pocket. Of course, if you go to court, there's probably a contingency fee agreement where if you do recover money for them, then the Church State Council and the lawyers that assist them will get reimbursed from that. But there's no charge out of the client's pocket. And that's a good thing for folks who have lost their job or, experiencing this kind of thing.
Well, in court, the law will require the company to pay your legal fees. So there's that. But, we really encourage, if people are having struggles with being required, to work on Sabbath, we prefer you call us before you lose your job, because we want to try, a lot of times if you do, we intervene with the employer and we get them to back down. It doesn't work all the time, for sure, but, we also have clergy on staff who can approach the employer not from a sort of combative, well, you better do the right thing or we're going to sue you approach, but, kind of pull moral authority and say, look, we expect you to do the right thing here.
Yeah,
appeal
to their nature. Yeah. That's important. So that's a great service. And again, people, if folks want to get in touch with you, they can go to the Church State Council website, churchstate.org, and contact you there. You can contact the conference. We can put you in touch as well. And Teresa, I just want to thank you for joining us today. Alan and I are going to continue on with the conversation. You're welcome to stay here if you like, or we'll probably let you sign off now if you want to. But thank you for sharing your story. And I wish you well, and I know that you've got good legal counsel and God's on your side here. So, any other closing thoughts, or before we let you go, Teresa?
No, just thank you for having me, and thank you for giving me the time to tell my story. And hopefully, someone out there that is going through the same thing doesn't feel like they're alone. That there is someone who has a voice for them.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you.
Well, and I would urge our listeners to pray for you, Teresa. Pray for this case, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And if you read the Pacific Union Recorder, if we get a favorable outcome, we'll certainly report it. We may report it even if we lose, but I don't know. We'll see. But this one, I kind of feel like we just have to win it.
Yeah, God willing. God willing.
Yeah.
Good stuff. Thanks, Teresa.
Thank you.
Oops, I cut her off. I need someone to help me man this thing. Well, that was good to have Teresa here. Really appreciated that. Alan, we're going to wrap this up soon, but do you want to say anything else about that before I ask you a couple questions?
Well, yeah, I just want to say another part of that story is our collaborations, because we have more people calling for help than we can possibly help just all by ourselves. So we have built lots of bridges with the employment lawyers community. And in Teresa's case, we have one of the top employment lawyers in the state who was lead trial counsel. And we're also working with the Religious Liberty Clinic at Stanford University Law School. So we had some of the very best and brightest young law students over a period of years working on her case as well, supervised by the faculty there. So, we certainly pulled out all stops to put the A-team together to go after the Department of Corrections here. So, if we lose, it won't be for lack of putting together a great team.
Yeah, absolutely. No, and I read the reply brief you sent me. It was really well done. Let's kind of shift for a minute, and I want to recognize that we may have some folks watching this now or in the future who are Christian employers, not employees necessarily. Mm-hmm. Maybe they have a small business. And let's talk about, how Christian employers can express their faith in the workplace. It's a question that I've been asked before. I actually did a seminar on it at ASI several years ago, and I think the law has pretty much stayed the same with that. But what rights do religious employers have to share their faith in the workplace with their employees? We want to, so kind of give us a summary maybe of that, and why, areas where they need to be careful not to harass. I think that's one of the big issues here, creating a hostile work environment basically for maybe a non-religious employee or someone who doesn't share their faith, right?
So, look, the harassment is probably understanding what harassment is and avoiding it is kind of the key. Because obviously, you're the employer, you certainly have the right to talk about religion. The problem comes when somebody may feel an obligation because there's a power disparity. You have power over them. They may feel some sense of obligation to respond, or if you invite them to church, maybe they feel obligated to go. They don't want to offend you. They don't want to lose their job. So it's certainly really important to make it clear and to have even written policies that any kind of religion is voluntary. If you want, for example, as an employer, to have a Bible study at the place of business, my suggestion would be that you don't have it during work hours, and that it be very clear that the policy is nobody has to come, and nobody's going to get treated any differently whether they come or they don't come, right? But I will say that doing these things, no matter how careful you are, doing these things definitely will open you up to being attacked, whether rightly or wrongly, whether by those who genuinely feel aggrieved, or simply take advantage unscrupulously and accuse you of religious harassment or religious favoritism or something. But, so it certainly helps to have very clear policies that nobody gets promoted, nobody gets job assignments, any favoritism based on their religious beliefs or conduct. I think probably living out our faith by the way we treat our employees is the most powerful witness that we can have. Showing care and compassion for them and encouraging them, learning the principles of servant leadership, and how we succeed by helping them succeed. There's two models of leadership. There's the power over and the power under. The power over is kind of the military command and control style of leadership. Well, that's really not consistent with the gospel, but it's what comes naturally to many of us. We have to study and learn servant leadership. I think if we do really practice the principles of Christ as a person in authority, that's going to be our most profound witness.
Yeah, I think that's important, and I think you're right. I've had some folks ask me, well, if I'm of a particular faith and I'm a small business owner, can I just hire people of my own faith? Where do I go astray? Where do I basically violate anti-discrimination laws? And so I think we should note that first of all, you have Title VII, which is the big law that applies to the whole United States, and it applies to employers with 15 or more employees, right? But then you have, the Fair Employment and Housing Act, which applies to employers with 5 or more employees, except for in cases of harassment, it applies to any number of employees, right? So, so you could say, well, maybe if you have, only 1 or 2, but generally I would say no. And again, so the law is you need to be neutral when it comes to hiring or the way you treat your employees, promotion, et cetera, when it comes to religion and these other issues. If you're a secular employer, I think we might want to talk a little bit about how religious organizations are exempted from these requirements, right? Just because I think a lot of folks are just thinking about the world we live in, and they've read like was it the Bostock case or Bostock that came down a couple of months ago or whatever. and
last year.
They're concerned about that. But I think unless your company has a primarily, like, it's a religious organization, right, whose primary purpose and everything you do is religious. In other words, it's not a
look. If you're a for-profit business,
right.
the law applies to you.
Right.
If you are a religious nonprofit, like a church or a church school, for example, then there's a different set of rules that apply to you, and certainly there are protections for you to be able to practice your faith. But if you're a for-profit business, you can't not hire someone because you think they're gay or they're transgender. I mean, those laws apply. And that's been the rule here in California long before the Supreme Court said that that was part of the federal statute. Many of our larger states all had those rules for a long time.
So let's shift from a legal standpoint to just the moral argument for or against that here. Why should, as a Christian, I be okay with, or maybe even not just okay with, but why should I want to, hire people regardless of their faith? Is there an argument to be made from a moral standpoint, or because of their, views on sexuality that might be different than my religious views on that?
Well, let me approach that this way, Steve. The basic premise of religious freedom is we those of us who want our own freedom, we want the freedom to live according to our own beliefs, our own identity, whether it's a Seventh-day Adventist identity or a Southern Baptist or whatever it might be, Muslim, Jewish. We have our own identity, our own beliefs, our own customs, and we want the freedom to follow that, which means the corollary, if we believe in the golden rule, is that we are also going to extend that same privilege to others. And we're going to respect, others. Their identity may be a different faith, maybe Muslim or Jewish, or, people use their sexuality as a basis of their identity. And that may not be consistent with our own religious belief, but it's their belief. And so I think that our best witness as a Christian and for the character of Christ, who gives all of us freedom, is simply to show respect and compassion and kindness to everyone and respect their freedom to live according to their own beliefs. Now, ultimately, when it comes to the workplace, there's certain basic values that a business may have, how we do customer service. And if somebody has a bad attitude, well, that's certainly a valid basis for discipline.
That's not protected that's not a protected class under the law to have a bad attitude.
Bad attitudes are not yet protected. No, maybe they should be. But our kids wish they were protected, I think, sometimes.
Right. And I think a lot of people, you have to understand there's something called protected classes, and there are things like race, gender, religion, and sexual orientation now that are reasons you cannot hire or fire or promote based on those reasons. Now, I want to just maybe help us reframe it just a little bit, though, for maybe those who are watching and saying, I just don't know if I want someone like that, someone who believes like that, someone whose lifestyle is like that as a part of my business. But what if we looked at it differently and said, this is an opportunity for us to be a blessing, to be a witness, to become a friend to someone that we disagree with. And here's an opportunity for you to share your faith in a very close and potentially very up close way, in a workplace environment with someone who's different than you. What an opportunity. I think we ought to be looking for opportunities to witness in the workplace in an appropriate manner. Like you mentioned earlier, just living out our faith, and maybe there's times to talk about it too. But instead of making Christians being known for being culture warriors who won't hire gay people or only hire people of their own faith or something like that, it seems like that really doesn't do us any favors when it comes to winning people over to our side.
So, look, John 3:16. Let's go back to basics. God so loved just people like us, people who have our values, who look like us.
Mhm.
No, the people, he says in the judgment parable that we're going to be judged on whether we saw Jesus and treated even the least of these. So whoever it is that you regard as the least,
Mm.
that's Jesus. And your standing in the judgment is based on, well, do you treat them like you would treat Jesus? You know, so the person that you're saying to yourself, I don't want to hire that guy. You know, I don't want to have to work with somebody who's like that. That person to you is the least. And that person to you is Jesus. And your obligation as a Christian is to treat them as you would treat Jesus. And if you do, and if you learn to see Jesus in them, well, guess what? They may just learn to see Jesus in you. You may be the very transforming influence that they were waiting for. And
we
never know.
Absolutely. I agree with you. I think we should note that, when it comes to religious organizations, choosing to hire people of their own faith, that's perfectly appropriate, not only on a moral basis, but legally as well. It's, of course, allowed. And if a church says, hey, we don't want to hire somebody who disagrees with our beliefs to be a teacher or a pastor or an employee.
Or even a secretary. You're allowed. That's legal and that's appropriate.
It's appropriate because they're representing the faith as opposed to, like a secular business or something like that. So I think we should make a differentiation there. But I think you're exactly right, Alan. It's an opportunity to do what Jesus said in Matthew 25. That's a good note to wrap things up on here. I've appreciated just talking with you, Alan, and I appreciate your spirit and approach to these issues, because I think that you talked about kind of our motivation, and I think that's been a thread I've felt we've had through this conversation, is that we want to have the spirit of Jesus as we deal with the real world, really, and that's what we're doing. We're talking about how we respond to.
Steve, I have said more times than I can count to clients that, we have no control over outcomes. We can't make the employer do the right thing. The only thing we can control is the quality of our witness. These conflicts are opportunities to witness for who Jesus is. And, I counseled a Walmart employee this week in another part of the country. They found us. And so I was chatting with her and I said, you can say to the manager, God has a claim on my time that's superior to your claim, to your, the company's claim. God is the higher authority, right? And that's our witness. The company thinks I'm the boss. I get to make the rules. I get to tell you when to jump and how high. Well, no, there's a limit to the authority that you have, Mr. Boss. God has a higher authority. And you may or may not choose to recognize that, but that's what we're talking about here, is God's authority over. It's not even so much my right to keep Sabbath or to go to church. It's God's right to our service. And Ellen White actually frames it in that way. That's where I got the idea from.
Neat. That's great. Well, thank you, Alan, so much for taking time to talk today. And I hope this webinar has been a blessing to our viewers and listeners, and something that's informative. And if you want to get in touch with Alan again, he's at the Church State Council, which is churchstate.org. You can find them there and get in touch with him there. So, Alan, God bless you. Thanks for your ministry. And I'm sure we'll be having you back here again in the future.
Thank you so much, Steve, for a great discussion.